Signore e signori, buonasera. Benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight at the Casa for this event that for us opens the exhibit that you will be able to see upstairs, an exhibit that is, of course, at the center of the Gray Art Gallery programming right now. They inaugurated last week. It's an amazing exhibit that's going to be the object of the conversation that follows. And I cannot but invite you very, very warmly to take time, go to the Gray, and make sure to plan to have a few hours, because each one of these photographs really tells a story. And it's beautifully set up. Lynn Gumpert, Lucy Oakley, and their colleagues did a fantastic job in putting it together. And of course, the curator of the exhibit, Enrica Viganò, that put all her energy in bringing this exhibit to New York. Some of you know probably that Neorealism really started in New York, and it might be a revelation, but if we consider that Rome Open City, when it opened in Italy, it was a complete fiasco. People would not go see it, and that's considered, as you know, traditionally, canonically, the film that opens the great season of Neorealism. And it's when it comes to New York, and there are lines around the block for weeks, people waiting to get in and see Rome Open City, that also in Italy, the wave of the success and of the resonance that that film has here in this city then helped and enabled Italians to look at that film and the films that followed in that tradition with different eyes. So there is a long love story between Neorealism and New York, and we are delighted to be part of that love story here tonight. So make sure to go to the exhibit at the Gray Art Gallery. Make sure also to take a look at all the programs that we created together, including many screenings that are going to take place here in this very room. So it's a chance for all of you who are already familiar with Neorealism to come and see again together some of these movies. And for those of you who know nothing, to have a beautiful crash course in that fantastic period and movement of Italian cultural history. Tonight's panel is going to be coordinated and chaired by my dear colleague Ara Merjian. Ara is a professor of art history and Italian studies here at New York University, and right now he's also the deputy chair of the department. His interests are in Italian and French and contemporary art history, futurism, the Italian avant-garde. His previous book is on Giorgio De Chirico and the Metaphysical City, and his new book is upcoming, and it's going to be on Pierpaolo Pasolini and contemporary art. A complicated and very complex relationship, and we look very much forward to the presentation that we'll definitely have here. And Ara, in turn, will introduce his guests for this talk. Please welcome Ara Merjian.
Thank you, Stefano, and thank you to everyone for coming out on a drizzly evening. Let's hope that we haven't jumped from summer into winter yet. Neorealism is a somewhat puzzling term. As many of you probably know, it is a term that is both retroactive and retrospective. It's a term with which its practitioners did not, in fact, baptize their creations as they were making them, both photographic, pictorial, literary, and cinematic. And indeed, the term came in the post-war period, particularly as we moved into the 50s and 60s, to be known in a variety of media. And in fact, Neorealism, as we'll, I'm sure, hear from our distinguished speakers, was not something that happened the minute that World War II ended in 1945. Marked a break in the 20th century. There were first flowerings of neorealism and various practices already under the fascist regime. We think that photography, what could be more intrinsically realist than photography, but as we'll hear and as we'll see, there were various limitations put on the nature of photographic representation, what it could and could be used to depict, particularly, for example, class relations. You did have early examples, for example, Occhio Quadrato by Lattuada, a photographer and writer whose work circulated in relatively limited circles, beginning, I believe, in 1941. Antonella, was it Occhio Quadrato, 1941? So there were various flowerings of neorealism before it became later baptized retrospectively neorealism. But I will leave the details to our distinguished guests. But Professor of Art History at CUNY and the Graduate Center, Antonella Pelizzari, and the curator of this wonderful show at the Grey Art Gallery, Enrica Viganò, who will speak to us first, followed by Professor Pelizzari, and then we'll open things up for discussion. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Enrica Viganò.
Buonasera a tutti. I would like to start thanking NYU, especially the Grey Art Gallery and Casa Italiana, for this opportunity to show Italian photography and share my research with the new audience. Neorealism is generally associated with cinema, the great Italian cinema, the cinema of ordinary people, of powerful sentiment, of heroism, of heartfelt compassion for some suffering and poverty, a cinema through which Italy declares the desire, its desire for change, for truth, for redemption after the humiliation suffered under fascism and the war.
E questo oggi? Ehi, pensatele! Ehi, pensai che dai qui! Tanto facile. Non deve essere molto comodo, giovanotto, viaggiare sul duro, eh? Da vedere che dovremmo mettere un materasso per i vagabondi. Avanti, avanti, facciamo presto. Oh, bisogna stare attenti, perché quelli sono capaci di portarsi via tutto il pollaio. Quanti litri vi faccio oggi? Fammi il pieno. Bragana! Bragana? No, non è ancora. Scusami. Scocciali. Sì. 3, 4.
Fiorello, un amore bello vicino a te, mi fa cantare, mi fa sognare, chissà perché.
Si mangia qui?
C'è il posto, è il posto. Attacchino. Stai da presente al centro affissioni. Gli dai sta carta e te porti a Al ladro! Che ti è successo?
Well, unforgettable movies of Neorealismo. And in actual fact, Neorealism was something vaster and more complex, not merely because it involved other spheres than cinema, such as literature and painting. It was more of a cultural experience. It was a contagious phenomenon, probably the last one of a truly national character. After investigating this huge phenomenon, our thesis is that continuity with the recent past was as important as severance. If neorealism came into existence, it is not only because Italy, after the liberation from fascism, went forward enthusiastically into a new age of democracy and creativity. Actually, it is important to consider that from the 1930s until the early 40s, a form of expression called realism was professionally used, according to the fascist regime, to represent a period of intense modernization which was to transform Italy into a land of evolved cities, of factories, of modernized rural areas, of a population composed by strong and active men and smiling girls. In 1932, an exhibition dedicated to the fascist revolution consecrates photography as a mass media, conferring to it an educational value that could reach and be understood by people at any level. To make it simple, Mussolini knew that what cinema and photography showed was perceived as true. Cinema and photography were perfect tools for his propaganda. He knew that their educational and informative functions should be exploited by their fullest in order to reach the illiterate Italian masses that had to be indoctrinated with an easily accessible language. As far back as the late 1920s, with the creation of Istituto Luce, with its cinema and photography sections, the fascist state engaged in a broad strategy of support and public control of the visual mechanical production, to such an extent as comparable only to that of the USSR of the time. Obviously, most of the photographic production, as well as the new reels, were under the strict control of fascist censorship. Actually, what was to be documented and what was not was very clear to everyone beyond the action of censorship. But, as always happens, exceptions and contradictions managed to escape the strictest controls. Photographers trained to portray the real world, quotation marks, for the regime, had a tool in their hands whose potential was far overreaching the one exploited by the regime. It happens thus that, together with the portraits of smiling workers, proud of the prosperity brought about by Mussolini, lenses focused also on situations of backwardness and poverty, or on custom and traditions that were miles away from the modernization proclaimed by Mussolini. Let's take two photographers as example. The first, Luciano Morpurgo, documented several times between 1920s and 30s pilgrims attending an ancient religious ritual. His intention was profoundly informative and educational. However, he knew very well that such images would not have passed censorship scrutiny. Therefore, he kept them in his drawers till the end of the war, while carrying on his profession as photographer of monuments and artworks. The second example, Giacomo Pozzi Bellini, in 1939 went to the extent of shooting a movie on the ritual called The Song of Maidens and bravely presented it to the Venice Film Festival. His style, raw and objective, had great success with his fellow film directors, but was immediately censored by the regime. Luckily, one copy of that movie was saved in France and recently restored. The same happened to the images of Pasquale De Antonis, fine documentary photographer, strongly involved and interested in Italian popular traditions and ceremonies. During the years of fascism, De Antonis was capturing reality in images of folk and religious fairs, which were kept hidden for decades, while he became an amazing, versatile photographer of elegant portraits, abstract photography, still lifes, and even a pioneer of fashion photography. But also in the fields of fascist rigid regulations, one finds so many images with a strong realistic edge that they end up underlying continuity more than antithesis with the following neorealistic period. In the archives of Istituto Luce, the regime's official institution for visual communication, there are images that already suggest some of the neorealistic visual expressions of the future. Look at this. In the late 30s, another important vehicle for realism was born, the Illustrated magazine. With the invention of rotogravure, magazines, created and directed by the Italian intelligentsia, experienced a powerful development, becoming an additional opportunity to develop also photographic language potentials. More folds in the rigid structure of control are to be found in the pages of these periodicals, where, next to Mussolini's feats and celebration, real-life scenes manage to appear. It is the case of Il Tempo, directed by Alberto Mondadori, and Omnibus, directed by Leo Longanesi with photos by Cesare Barzacchi, a weekly magazine on politics and literature that will be shut down by fascist censorship after less than 2 years of activity. The one that escaped censorship, but its author and photographer, Alberto Lattuada, as you were mentioning, has been called into the police office for a control, pursues objectivity in photography in contrast with the prevailing formal aesthetics. We find also truly peculiar personalities such as Lamberti Sorrentino, a well-known fascist reporter turned into hero thanks to his courage. Sorrentino reached the height of his success in the front line of the Spanish Civil War. First Italian photographer to publish on life, he fell from grace after criticizing a Romanian dictator, friend of Mussolini. He ended up in concentration camp, survived, and after the war kept on working as photojournalist, applying his realistic edge to much different subjects than those that had made him a press hero during fascism. In the years before the liberation, there were other experiences that were fundamental in the evolution of the language of Italian photography, such as the anti-pictorial landscapes and architecture by Giuseppe Pagano, and the Luigi Veronesi photomontage applied to graphic and advertisement, without leaving out the work of Stefano Bricarelli in Turin, or examples of professional reportage as those by Fedele Toscani and Tullio Farabola. With the demise of fascism, freedom of speech and the precarious conditions of a nearly destroyed Italy created a perfect scenario for the explosion of neorealism. Vladimiro Settimelli wrote, "It is then, in tune with neorealistic cinema and literature of protest, that Italians began to discover the true nature of their country, a country plagued by atavism, with the South anchored in the 19th century and the North that had to be rebuilt. Freedom of expression and the need to rebuild a new Italy identity spurred the desire of documenting life, testifying what is true, and investigating on the ground. Many illustrated magazines are published, researches on ethnographic topics are carried out, and there is a growing interest in knowing how do people live in faraway regions. The whole human society is in a state of ferment and needs to be photographed in all its aspects and contradictions. At this point, who had influenced whom, or whether cinema, literature, or photography had arrived first, no longer mattered, because the fervor driving creators toward social documentation had become a choral phenomenon. Cesare Zavattini declared, "Neorealism implies a true act of generosity in terms of the time, eyes, and ears lent to one's own country, story, and people." Zavattini's innovative and drawing definitions and the debates and meetings of film directors will set the boundaries of neorealism with its criteria of objectiveness, informative purpose, didactic intent, creation of a social consciousness. Criteria to be developed through techniques more theoretical than practical, ranging from annihilating the eye behind the lens to shadowing people in their day-to-day life. Neorealism in photography does not identify itself with the school and remains a free whole of voices. For sure, some of the photographers that we arbitrarily trace back to the neorealistic poetics had very different cultural approaches to their work for what concerns both targets and intentions. Here we have some examples. Since those we consider neorealistic photographers, on the contrary of filmmakers, never gave themselves any code, never organized in a group, never published a manifesto, the way to read their works in the context of neorealism passes through concepts that were elaborated at a later time, as Ara was commenting. One of the most widespread and common concepts is that of environmental representation. I mean, Italy of the people, farmers, blue-collar workers, and proletarians in general, peddlers, beggars, and children in the street. But environmental representation is not enough to identify neorealistic photography. The substantial premise of neorealistic photography is sharing a function of vast social significance. Exactly what the fascist regime was using for its propaganda, also referred to as educational function. Now, after the end of the war, the community can afford a propaganda-free social conscience, and photography keeps on being the best medium of visual communication, thanks also to the widespreading of illustrated magazines. Magazines which were the privileged standpoint from where to discover other Italies, look out at the people way of living, discover ancient traditions, document the destruction of the country, explore faraway places, and keep an eye on the progress. In order to try to determine some conceptual fields of reference, we could focus on three definitions: inquiry project, cognitive journey, and I changed this popular photography. I've changed the translation because they don't sound correct. Sorry. The field of inquiry project, which refers to photo investigations, from scientific missions to the on-the-ground reportage, is the most appropriate level, satisfying all the objective, informative, didactic, and social conscious neorealistic criteria. It is the field most connected to Zavattini's theories. To be clear, the photographer disappears and becomes a witness a documenter at the service of reality, a photojournalist recording information on film. Under this definition, we can file some of De Martino's important ethnological investigation works, in which he involved several photographers. Scientific expeditions where photography was a needed support to the research. The photographs by Ando Gilardi are a significant example of it. And the work of Franco Pinna, again with the ethnographer De Martino's expeditions in the years 52-56, is maybe the most relevant example, together with that one of Arturo Zavattini, son of Cesare Zavattini. This category holds whenever we find a project intending to document a specific social reality, whether inside a scientific mission or not, like in Tranquillo Casiraghi's work, revealing his neorealistic conscience in his intent to document a disappearing society. He documents life at Torretta, a farming settlement at the doors of Milano, where he himself lived. Or in the work of Renzo Chini, who in Piombino, Tuscany, documented thoroughly the effects of the shutdown of a factory till then sustaining the whole economy of the town. A true investigation which was to be published in the series of books curated by Zavattini right after the famous Un Paese with photos by Paul Strand. Paul Strand was collaborating with Zavattini. Into this conceptual field we include also those photojournalistic works of great respect, such as the one by Federico Paltellani on Sardinia, issued in 6 installments in the magazine Tempo. Surely this is a good example of journalistic investigation with social denunciation. Another case that rightfully pertains to this field is that of the photo documentaries published on the magazine Cinema Nuovo. These were reportages realized by photographers on a specific topic with the intent of suggesting new ideas for films in the neorealistic key. In the show at Grey Art Gallery, you have both the original pictures and some issues of the Cinema Nuovo magazine. The second field, that one of the cognitive journey, gathers all the travel photography intended as exploration of unknown places and faraway cultures, although these cultures still part of the same country. In this case, the approach is more subjective, less scientific, although it retains a certain respect for objectivity. Certainly, there is more of an interpretative factor. This is the category to which belong most of the photographers we have considered. In some cases, the cognitive journey is an ideal itinerary meant to demonstrate a thesis. For example, that progress is necessary to fight against misery. Or, on the contrary, that industrialization could destroy ancient societies, traditions, and local identities. Sometimes these traveling photographers were socially and politically committed. Nevertheless, some others, the spur to their investigations could simply spring out of the thirst of knowledge without being influenced by ideology. The mosaic becomes more and more complex and gives us back the images of 100 Italies through the eyes of storytellers such as Nino Migliori with his works Gente dell'Emilia and Gente del Sud, people from Emilia and people from the south, or the works of the photographers who investigated the town of Milano such as Enrico Cattaneo, Alfa Castaldi, Ugo Zovetti, Ugo Mulas, and Mario Carrieri. Carlo Bavagnoli in Rome with his view of the quarter of Trastevere. Piero Donzelli with the images of the river Po's Delta. And the artists that told us stories about southern Italy, such as Fulvio Reuter, Calogero Cascio, Caio Garruba, Mimmo Castellano. The third field, that of popular photography, maybe is the most distant from strict neorealistic criteria, but still retaining a fundamental relationship with reality, although more sketchily documented. Picturesque, I would say, in the romantic 18th century sense, evoking positive feelings. It coincides mostly with street photography. Il Mondo magazine makes an extensive use of it in the wake of the old omnibus by Longanesi that I was mentioning before. And another stream develops around this kind of photography. Sketchy. In any case, in those years, there is a growing demand for images, and photography literally invades any kind of communication media, from the highest ones addressed to a cultivated audience, as is the case of the magazine Il Politecnico, where Luigi Crocenzi can freely express himself with his photo tales, down to photoromanzi, which is, that's after, to photoromanzi, which are popular publication with novels illustrated by stage photographs and short text, a typical Italian phenomenon. In this phase of national recovery, what prevails is the need of collective identification, and the media that can contribute to reach it is photography, with its educational function that once was exploited by fascism, but now contributes to democratization. Especially in that moment of enthusiasm that followed the World War II, the number of newspapers and magazines increased a lot, and the information they spread was highly committed. There is a choral push to grow, to be informed, to criticize, to debate. But we have to say that unfortunately from 1948 things start to change because of the polarization in politics, and in journalism people clearly begin to side with one political party or another. In the meanwhile, the amateurs club, the photo club, were trying hard to define the art of photography. And in that environment, the neorealistic poetics was received in very, very different ways. Some of the photographers considered the criteria of neorealism as a limitation to the wide range of creative possibilities of the artist, and so they refused them altogether. On the contrary, some others regarded the approach to reality and their commitment as an occasion to break free from the excessive formalism and the oleographic banalities that were characterizing most of the fine art photography until then. The debate was intense and caused divisions, attempts of intermediations, and unavoidable struggles among the juries of the many amatorial photographic competitions. Here I put some more formal and aesthetics and some that went towards neorealism issues. The origins of my personal investigation date back to 1999, when a first show with 10 artists was presented in Madrid and has been growing up until it reached its final shape, with what you can see on the walls of the Grey Art Gallery and the Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò. Almost 200 photographs, magazines of those years, fragments of films, photobooks, original playbills, backstage photos from the most important movies of Italian Neorealism, and so on. A complete view of this research is presented in a book that was first published in Italian, then in Spanish, and in German edition, and finally Prestel del Monaco Books in New York, in co-publication with Admira Milano, issued the English version of this book. Allow me to say, it's like a Bible for the people studying this, for including many entries at the end of the book, notes, info, plus a chronology, and the biographies of all the people that have dealt with photography in those years. The result is a fresco, sketched out by overlapping experiences that, although they differed widely from one another, use the same documentary yet deeply lyrical language. Italo Calvino, in his foreword to The Path to the Nest of Spiders, gives one of the most appropriate definitions of neorealism. Neorealism has not been a school, rather a set of voices disclosing different Italies unknown until then. Without the diversity of those Italies, unknown one by the other, neorealism could not have happened. To close my speech, I would like to share a personal memory. In a letter written to me at the time I began to take an interest in neorealismo, Mario Giacomelli, our maestro of photography in Italy, summed up in the form of verse my feelings towards this phenomenon in the history of Italian photography. These are his words: reality as ourselves, as internal discipline, as skin and soul. In the hundreds of images that I have seen and gathered in many years, I have perceived this delicate vibration of skin and soul hundreds of times. Then, following a scientific approach, I have come to make clear distinctions, of course, among the different issues and criteria of neorealism. But that enchantment still remains intact. Thank you.
Welcome everybody. I didn't expect such a big crowd, and I have to thank obviously NYU and Grey Art Gallery and Enrica for bringing these works to the attention of New York City. This is something I want to bring up in our panel discussion. One doesn't get to see these photographs that much in the United States. For that matter, we might wonder in Italy. Some of these works are at the Museum of Modern Art, a few others at the Metropolitan Museum, a few others I can think of at Houston, Texas, and there's a gallery here, Keith Ellis, who represents a lot of this work, and yet we know that it is a rare opportunity to be able to see these works together and to be able to discuss that in this context that obviously brings together the arts with Italian studies. My position right now is not that of giving you a lecture because I feel this is a panel and I could give you a lecture, and I would love to do that, but I don't think this is the context. I thought I would show you a few more images, some of which you've seen, some of which are obviously in the show, and I would bring up questions that we can debate soon after. And as I do that, I want to share an anecdote as well as Enrica just shared her memory. My anecdote is about a phone call I had with Enzo Sellerio, a photographer who is no longer with us, but at that time was very much so. We're talking about something like 2010, when I was in the process of publishing my book on Italian photography. And I was actually in Chelsea, and I received this phone call out of the blue, out of Palermo, in which Sellerio is extremely preoccupied and truly does not want this to happen, that I will publish in my book this photograph to represent him. I will never forget, I had never met Enzo Sellerio, unfortunately, a very smart man who also opened the publisher in Palermo. So I didn't know him personally, unlike other photographers. By the way, in parentheses, we can say that Enrica has also had the challenge of working with Italian photographers, which is not easy because there's a lot of constant contention. It's funny, but it's actually true. And in any case, I became friends with many of them. I did not know Sellerio. And so he didn't want me to publish this photograph, and obviously I needed this copyright permission, and I wouldn't cross that road. What are you looking at here? You're looking at this beautiful, lyrical, if you will, picture that he took in a village very close to Palermo, Partinico, where the scene represents this old elderly woman opening this shrine, and this is part of a devotional practice of decorating the shrine with oranges. That's what you see on top of the shrine. It's a little strange, but that's what's going on. It's a custom of that area. And then, of course, you see poverty, right? You see this rag hanging from this very basic hanging rod, and you gather that the elderly woman is also pretty poor. Why didn't you want me to publish this? Several reasons. I didn't want to be represented as the photographer of misery, and I didn't want to be associated with devotion and Catholicism. And he at that time also was very belligerent towards the page into which this photograph was published on Cinema Nuovo, which is something that the show presents. Cinema Nuovo is a very particular publication, and obviously was directed by a man from the cinema, Guido Aristarco, who was very left-leaning. And at this moment, in fact, Neorealist film was in crisis. There wasn't a lot of money, as was brought up earlier. Neorealist film had a lot of success in the United States, but Italians were a little tired of seeing people starving. They were actually daydreaming for an economic growth and some fun. And so Italian film at this point in time was in crisis as pertains neorealism. So this journal, Cinema Nuovo, took on this really interesting initiative for Italian photography of publishing what they called fotoracconti, so let's say photo essays, in which they assigned each photographer to go to particular regions and villages and show the problems, show the misery. Why was that? In 1948, the Christian Democrats won, and the Italian Republic was founded. The Italian Communist Party was also very strong at this point in time, and a true conflict of media and a true battle of images started then. All this is to contextualize this image and try to explain to you why Sellerio had some issues with it. I was very naive at the time. I was in love with his work, and obviously he had to be in the book. Can I have the next picture? Okay, so this is the image that ended up in the book, and we were fine with it, and I could get the copyright permission. But obviously you understand what's going on here. This is also lyrical image, we can say. It's a, what, if we were French, we would call it a tranche de vie. It's a slice of life. Is a humorous and sympathetic view. Glance at his city that he loved so much, where he did not want to think of mafia, he didn't want to think of stereotypes of any sort, but rather enjoyed looking at these kids happenstance passing in the road with these chairs on their heads. So I am presenting these two images as a true anecdote, and I can give you more anecdotes if I think of every single image in my book post-1940s, because I had a lot of conversations with photographers, but this seems apropos with what we're debating today, neorealism, questions of obviously poverty and suffering, and how does the photographer commit to that, engages with that, and so on and so forth. Can I have the next? So this is the context, right? I'm a true believer that photography needs to be seen in context. And this show gives some justice to that, but obviously you see a lot of photographs because photography, the nature of photography is most of the times that of printed media. But obviously when we see that on the wall, it gets framed and it becomes a whole other object. Well, the photograph that Sellerio didn't want me to publish, you see it here on the top right in the page of the Fotoracconti Cinema Nuovo, and what you see here and here are images also by Sellerio that show a man that was considered mentally ill under the bars, and then the one at the bottom, the black sign is a signal of mourning, of death. This is obviously the cover. Can I have the next one? Can I have the next one? Yes, this is another page we just saw, the one on the top right. This is a man with who has tuberculosis, some children in school. Can I have the next one? And this is another one which is pretty raw, obviously, of this woman is emaciated child, and other incredibly striking signs of poverty and starvation, if you will. The particular essay was called Borgo di Dio, so a village of God, and in fact this was a documentation of the misery of this area, but there was a sociologist behind it, Danilo Dolci, sort of a Gandhi has been said, of Italy, starving himself to fight for his causes, who had created this model village in which he was hoping, an utopian kind of village in which he was hoping things could be better. So that's the story, right, of Sellerio's Borgo di Dio and the particular photographs that he took under this commission. Okay, can I have the next one? Just to give you more context, and you just saw, and you can see that in the show, the photograph by Chiara Samugeo, who became a photojournalist, and these photo documentari were incredibly important for Italian photographers because up until then they had not been exposed to the question, can you tell us a story with photographs? And having full 3-4 pages with a written essay in which they could express their vision was extremely important. So Chiara Samugeo was the other one. Can I have the next slide? And this is the spread of her children in Naples, in which you get the clear sense of where these Fotoracconti wanted to go. And that was stated in some of the pages, the statement being, we want to show that Italy is still poor, and the undertone was the Christian Democrats do not want to see that. They do not want to show that in their media. So I'm bringing this up to say it's very, I think, important to think about the agencies behind the photographs that we see in this exhibition. Can I have the next one? Okay, this is a repetition. Okay, and so I'm going to try to sketch 3 agencies here, and I'm only in the post-war years. I could go on and on about the fascist years, because actually something I'm studying at the moment. But dealing with the 50s, right, or post-1948, let's say, one agency that is very clear and that is connected to Cinema Nuovo is this one, and there are some examples of this in the show. I believe Spazio was another magazine affiliated with the Communist Party, and so was Vie Nuove. And this is a page from Vie Nuove. And when you read the text, it's pretty overt that the documentation is towards the poverty, the war orphans, and obviously the battered towns such as Cassino, that was heavily bombed by the Americans. So that's a chronicle, but obviously the agenda behind that is we have to see this, and this is the journal that's going to show that to you. The Christian Democrats will never look at it, and obviously the cover on the right is very clear. The head of the Italian Communist Party, Togliatti, whose ghost is the great philosopher who died in jail, victim of fascism, writing those beautiful quaderni that we should all read, Antonio Gramsci. So there is this saint figure, right, behind the current head of the political party of communism. Can I have the next one? So that's one agency, right? It's clearly mediated by certain communist journals, and many of these photographers are also in the Communist Party and are true believers. They have an ideology at work, and the readers, we need to understand and think about that. The readers are that kind. Not everybody is looking at Vie Nuove. The second agency is this one, and you've seen already the image on the left, striking. Franco Pinna is perhaps my all-time favorite photographer that is represented in the show. He was affiliated to the Communist Party, and he had a great vision, and he was a great printer. But very important is the fact that he was working for the man you see in the middle. Ernesto De Martino was also inspired by Gramsci and was really zoning and zooming into what it meant, what the Italian South meant at this time. What was the meaning of witchcraft? What was folklore? What was the meaning of certain dances or languages or dialects? And you see him working. I love this image because you understand how photography was part of audio and cinema, right? It was part of a whole research. And the photographer was feeding that research, sheer anthropological research. And the third agency, can I have the next one, please, is part of this story, and that had a lot to do with what the United States was doing for Italy after World War II, and the old Marshall Plan reconstruction program, in which it's very interesting to see photographers of work of the kind of Marjorie Collins, who was an American photographer, interesting enough, at work during the Farm Security Administration, the American Depression in the 30s. She was sent to Italy to document. You see her. This is Marjorie. High heels documenting this family in Sicily, and I couldn't do that, but it's an introduction shot. And so this is one of her photographs documenting the so-called Sassi in Matera. I think we'll have more opportunities to debate this later, and also at NYU later on this year, was this one of the peaks of primitivism connected to literature such as Carlo Levi's Christop ed Eboli, and it was this site where people were rediscovered living in the caves like animals, with animals, after World War II. So a site of shame, right? That's the word. And of course, the ideology behind this is also that of going to the rescue, which was extremely useful and helpful, but also having a sort of potentially condescending view of that primitivism. Can I have the next one? And I don't think I am forcing that interpretation when we think of how Italy was represented with one picture only, unfortunately, in the famous, super important exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, The Family of Man, curated by Edward Steichen, who is the man you see here. This is the only image that was in the show that you can recognize here. This was huge enlargement. And this image is not in this exhibition. I don't even know when where we could find it really. But the tone of that, of this family again in the south, in Sicily, the familial nucleus, really in poverty, the bare bone of their economy, is something that we can associate, right, with some of the aesthetics we see in this exhibition. And can I have a couple more? 1955, interesting enough, is also the year when Paul Strand, the great modernist American photographer, publishes his book with Einaudi, the great left-leaning Turin publisher, in collaboration with Cesare Zavattini, the great theorist of Italian Neorealism in cinema, who, by the way, had been incredibly active in the media during the 30s. And with this image that has become iconic, I think if we have to think of Italian icons post-war, we think of this, and we think of Anna Magnani in Roma Città Aperta. It's one of those images that we have seen many times, we recognize, and we recognize with an analogy, the immediate analogy to family, a unified family, except that obviously the father is no longer there because he's a victim of war or fascism, and poverty, and a rural economy. Well, this is one story. The other story, and it is true because I have it here, is in the same year, in 1955, is this media. Is the media of Mondadori, is the media of Rizzoli, is the media that wants to achieve that coverage and the gossip and the glamour and that fun and that great 600 car that conveys that economic boom. And it's very interesting to think of this photograph and my Sellerio contention and this representation of Italy vis-a-vis this. I have one more image. This is Epoca, Mondadori, and Tempo. That is, if we want to provoke this, in 1949, obviously the Christian Democrats are in power, and here is the Italian Miss with this Lucky Strike bikini. So you understand how complex this all is in a beautiful way. But complicated. I don't think it is possible to. I don't think it is possible to pin down what an image of Italy is after World War II, or for that matter before World War II. The point of Neorealism is so interesting because obviously it ties in with the other big question of humanism and humanist photography, and I really want to recommend a wonderful book that we will be able to discuss at this university that Martina Caruso has written on humanist photography. Is this attention on the part of the photographers towards humanity, towards human values, towards society altogether. How do we bring that concept that is across the board of post-war life to the particular Italian case? Is it true that we can say that Neorealism is an authentic Italian moment, and how does Italy cope with all these different forces, political forces at work? Is something I think would be interesting to discuss more. Okay. Bye.
Thank you both for those wonderful introductions to neorealism in general and to its particular manifestation in post-war photography, as we are lucky to have it just across Washington Square. I'd like to open things up to our prodigious audience here, which I'm sure has some questions for our guests. And is there one of these that's past circulating? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the magnificent presentations, the fascinating lectures, and the wonderful selection of images.
There's a microphone right there.
One of the photographs shown tonight was by a photographer, Carlo Kozulic, and in I think 1997 here at Casa there was an exhibit of a contemporary Italian photographer, Giorgio Kozulic de Pecine, whose exhibit was on the Aeolian Islands. It was a superb show, and I was wondering if there is any connection, if you folks are aware. It's Kozulic spelled the same way. Giorgio Kozulic de Pecine, Il Sussurro del Silenzio was a book that came out shortly after that.
No, actually, the son of Carlo Kozulic, who I just spoke with him, is coming to New York to see the show, has nothing to do with photography. So I guess it's not the same family.
Thank you.
Other questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi, congratulations for the presentations. I wanted just to ask about the photo clubs. I think you spoke about the photo clubs. I've read about the Cine Club after the war, in the tradition of the Cine Club in Italy, but I didn't know there was a photo clubs, and I don't know what they did, or if they just, was it only like photography contests, as you said, or I don't know if you could expand on that.
Yes, no, it's a good question, because as Enrica is also pointing out, there is, we can say, professionalism and amateurism. I mean, a lot of these photographers, Camisa was this very graphic composition. He was working in the chemical industry in Milan, I believe. So a lot of these photographers were not working for magazines, right? So, I mean, the question is, who is a photographer? Right? Is a photographer an artist? Is a photographer a photojournalist? How does a photographer make an image? Well, okay, I can't say the percentage right now, but many of these photographers were not working professionally as photographers, had other jobs. And many of these photographers were seeking venues to exhibit their work. So the phenomenon of the photo club, and I cannot tell you all of them, but certainly there are many photo clubs. And one of them really very important was a photo club Centro in Fermo, directed by Crocenzi, that was giving space, right, to photographers to debate, to show their work, to discuss. In New York, we had the Photo League, right, in the 1930s. Well, that was like a photo club. It was a place where photographers were desperate to get some attention to their work. There was an important one in Milan. In fact, Cesare Colombo, I think, was very involved, a wonderful, also human being. What was the name? Circolo Fotografico Milanese.
Circolo Fotografico Milanese.
That I think was incredibly important to bring many photographers to coalesce this together in that context. I think Italy as always presents this question of regionalism. So you have many, I think, photo clubs depending on the area.
I would say that in that instance as well, there's the precedence of the Cine Gouffre, right, under fascism. Yeah. So it's not as if these cinema clubs suddenly flower as of 1946, 47, 48. They had a precedent under the regime. Of course, it was baptized under the culture of fascism.
Alberto Lattuada was an example of Cine Gouffre.
So I think what's important about Enrica's show and about both presentations is this genealogy that goes back during fascism and is incubated in various ways, both subterranean and manifest, but that in fact I think one of the great the parameter of the show being from the 30s to the 60s really helps people, I think, in coming to grips with the fact that neorealism was not suddenly born with the liberation of Italy. So the same with the clubs in a certain sense.
And if I may say, the reason why we have a chapter in the show and in the book about the photo clubs called From Art to Document is exactly because in the photo clubs was the only place where debates about photography was carried on. Because we didn't have institution, we didn't have MoMA, we didn't have these activities. We just had these very familiar kind of clubs, but with such a power, because they were connected all among them in Italy and in Europe because of the contest, because of these amazing competitions they were sending all around. And that's so interesting also, because since the correspondence was written between one photographer and the other, we are now producing several interesting books, like the one about Camisa, of the correspondence between these artists. Other names are La Gondola, La Bussola. There are really many of very, very important. And the criticism, the capacity of debating and investigating about photography, and the most important critics and historians also come from these photo clubs, because it was the only place we had.
Where does Now Let Us Praise Famous Men fit into the pantheon of the German
I don't hear, sorry.
Where does Now Let Us Praise Famous Men?
A.G. and Walker Evans, because it was published in 1936, I believe, which is the start of your.
Or I want to say a little later. I think 41. But sorry, your question is, where is the book?
No, what kind of influence did it have? The FSA, the Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. I look at these photographs, and there are many direct references. I mean, they're just complete direct references.
Okay, so in the post-war years, we know the Elio Vittorini, who ran this very intellectual magazine called Il Politecnico. He published some of Walker Evans' work. Now, you are asking us when did Italians see this book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men? That's a good question. I don't think for a long time.
This was one of the problems, in fact, because especially during the 20 years of fascism, most of the photography that was done here, like farm security administrations, Walker Evans, was not arriving into our country. But some of the elite, maybe that were traveling to France or whatever, had the chance to look at some books, but the majority of the photographers I interviewed didn't hear and didn't read about and didn't see the pictures until the 50s when the exchange of books internationally started.
Can you speak, please, to the presence or absence of women photographers in the
Should I?
Can you repeat?
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. So the question is, can you speak to the absence or presence of women photographers in neorealism?
Well, I was very attentive to include all the women photographers that were publishing in the magazines or were investigating. And so we have some wonderful examples like Samugeo, Rastellini, Mangini. But what we found was not so many, and this is something that continues.
Oh, sorry. Person over here. Yeah. Sure.
Thanks. You all both make reference to the degree to which photography becomes influenced by politics. I think you specifically mentioned the election of '48 and the polarization both before and after. Was photography of the right, with a conservative editorial view, was it always just a photography about gossip and high society and consumerism, or was there more going on there?
Okay, so Federico Patellani, who is featured a great deal in this exhibition, as an interesting story that in part replies to your question, in the sense that he worked in the 30s, he went to Ethiopia, he was a monarchist. And then he worked for Tempo, was a very important photographer for Tempo. And we see in the show this striking image of the miners in Carbonia. And he photographed a lot of babes and a lot of contests for Miss this and that. I think when we think of magazines, we need to ask the question not about what is the photographer doing, but what does the magazine want. So with that, it's my experience that these magazines very rarely show the problems. These ones, the communists, they do. Now, continuing with that discussion, which is a really interesting one, one also finds many photographers who are, let's say, apolitical, right? So Enrica mentioned this group of La Bussola, which means the compass, and they clearly made the point of saying, we are not interested in documenting, we are interested in creating striking artistic statements. And that happens as well post '48. In fact, there was a manifesto. It was in 1947. So I don't know. Does that answer?
Yeah, that helps. Enrica, congratulations on the book being published in English. That's wonderful that we have that. I happen to see in very tiny print, and you didn't mention it, that Martin Scorsese is doing the foreword. I happen to notice in very small print that Martin Scorsese wrote the foreword. Yes. I know that Martin Scorsese is a proud graduate of NYU, and obviously we all know Martin Scorsese for his film. Maybe you can share with the audience his how how the photos have influenced his filmmaking, and the whole connection to this genre of Italian photography.
Well, when we were thinking of an American person to write the foreword, I immediately thought of Martin Scorsese, especially for his amazing documentary film called Voyage in Italy, where he's putting together all the movies in Italian cinematography that influenced him. And he was like devoting a huge thank to Italian neorealism photography. So the idea was to have someone with a point of view from abroad to write about Italian neorealistic photography. And actually, when he accepted, thanks to NYU, to write the text, he was mentioning several photographs that are not so well known abroad. So I think he really investigated before. He was in touch with the Gruppo Friulano that was founded by Zanier, and he had many informations, and so this we thought was the perfect choice. And also he was very moving in the words. He was really explaining how this was on a human point of view very important, because he was watching these movies with his grandparents when he was a child, and so this history that not only are in the movies but also in the photographs, and in the still photographs you can like freeze a moment, and so the emotion, he wrote really wonderful words, I must say, for us.
I don't want to scare anybody with this microphone. More than a question, it's an impression I had when I saw the exhibition on the Great Gallery the other day. I noticed one thing, that the pictures are from all over Italy, so there is no like a concentration on South or Rome. Yeah. And what it was for me stunning is this, that for the first time, compared to modern time, in photography, I saw the faces of Italians they're very similar. What I'm saying is I couldn't, until I saw Sardinia or Sicily or Tuscany or somewhere in the Northeast, I couldn't say that the expression in the eye was from somebody from the North or somebody from the South. Today, if I see a picture, I can tell you right away. You show me any picture, I can tell you that person from the North, that's from the South. So my is an impression that was only mine, so it's crazy, or it's something that actually is a time, an historic time. Italy after the war was, I mean, all the people, all Italian past, they were not like probably rich and poor. I mean, they were all suffering. Or is a way that those photographers were able actually to finally unify Italy in this way?
I think some of these aesthetics conveys a sense of universalism, and certainly there's poverty, and maybe that's part of the reason why. I mean, there's no fashion, there's nothing that characterizes the time or the place. I don't know, but obviously it's a complicated question, because I don't think we can racially define who is Southern or Northern.
It's interesting because a figure like Pasolini would say precisely the opposite, right? That up until the 60s, Italy was a land of vernacular cultures, traditions, dress, dialects, faces that you could tell a sub-proletariat face from a bourgeois one, and that with the economic boom and with the Truman Doctrine and the rise of commodities, that Italy was completely leveled, right? That you couldn't tell a middle-class Torinese from someone from Sardinia, etc. So that might just be an impression from the photographs. I mean, they tend to, as one of the sort of labels that's repeated in the exhibition says ethnographic exploration, and there is a kind of ethnographic sort of element to them, which is, I think, common to a lot of the photographs, but you know, physiognomically and in terms of class and in terms of dress, I think there are some nuances between, you know, some of the different subjects, but that's an interesting question. I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Just on that, I was wondering if maybe you should just turn the question around. I mean, maybe it was that the photographers who were out working in the field in Italy in those years were looking for something essentially Italian. That's what they wanted to photograph, and that so maybe it's not it's that their vision is what informed the photographs, as opposed to the photographs as essentially describing something else, something political or something regional.
I mean, one question one could add to this debate is what happens when then a French photographer or an American photographer photographs these people, right? Which, you know, Cartier-Bresson went to Scanno, where Giacomelli went, Strand went to Luzzara. So what are we looking at? Right. So don't have, it would be a long answer, but I think, yeah, the question.
Grazie. I'm curious to know, with the American Marshall Plan, was there any pressure from the American government against any of the photographs, let's say, of the South, the poverty in the South, or of the working class in the North, the struggles and so forth, in order to show that this was not the reality in Italy any longer?
Well, I can just tell you a famous sentence by Giulio Andreotti, who was against the neorealism, saying that we should not wash our dirty laundry abroad. So for sure, after the magic moment of the 3 years from 45 to 48, when the publications, when the passion for showing Italy and for trying to create an identity, a national democratization, and it was really outside the parties. Then when I was speaking about the polarization, the magazines need to take a position, the photographers were working for the magazines, and so Giulio Andreotti was Democrazia Cristiana, who made the agreement, the government made the agreement for the Marshall Plan. So all these changed a lot. The point of view of being on one side or the other, that is very important in the history of Italy.
Thank you everyone for coming, and please join me in thanking our 2 speakers.